the music always comes first, and that the emotional connection between a song and the listener, that's what you're selling in mastering. I think we've kind of gotten off into the weeds with people being very oriented towards gear and signal processing and things like that. And I think that's kind of a mistake, because really what you should be thinking about is, how does the song make you feel?
Welcome to the Production Masters Podcast, the philosophies and techniques behind making music according to the masters of music production. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Production Masters Podcast. This is Owen from Ice Cocoon and productionmasters.net. Firstly, a couple of things. My apologies for the break in transmission and the irregularity in scheduling just of late. Just to fill you in a bit on who we've got coming up, I've got Thomas Eberger from Stockholm Mastering. I have the legendary engineer and producer Flemming Rasmussen, who you probably know from doing Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning. He'll be coming on the podcast at some stage. I have another engineer called Zlaja Hadzic. I don't know if that's how you say it correctly, but obviously I'll make sure I'm onto that when the time comes. He's originally from Sarajevo in Bosnia, but moved to Holland where he recorded The Gathering, which is how I came to know about his work. So we'll be talking pretty soon. Also, Stephen W. Taylor. Although I actually had some albums with his work on it, I didn't realize it until I bought the Kate Bush live album, Before the Dawn, and the mixing on that is just absolutely sublime. The power and the complete usage of dynamic range just absolutely is used to maximum musical effect. It's fantastic. So I reached out to him, and that's going to happen at some stage. Also, I've been requested to interview Jens Bulgren. I have reached out to Jens, and I'm waiting to hear back from him. Hopefully that happens, because that would be very cool. I'd really enjoy that one as well. And on to today's guest, it's Mr. Dave Collins. If you aren't already familiar with him, he's a Grammy Award-winning mastering engineer, and he's done everything from Madonna to Ben Harper, Motley Crue, Alice Cooper, Metallica, Queens of the Stone Age. We had a great chat. He was really, really cool to talk to. We talked about his career, where he came from, being mentored by Doug Sachs, amongst others, and talked about his approach to mastering, how it's really, like you hear with all these guys at the top of their game, it's about the music, not about the technical side of things. All of that and more is in the interview. There'll be a detailed list of the questions and the things that we talked about in the show notes, and also it'll be in the descriptions when it's on YouTube. So also you can check out the podcast at Castbox. You can subscribe and like on iTunes and at Stitcher Radio, and of course the main site, productionmasters.net. So that's it. Let's get straight into my very early morning and his mid-afternoon chat with Dave Collins. Yeah, I'm up and I've had some Wheat Bix and drinking a coffee. So, and I should sound a bit happier as well, like, because I'm getting to chat to you, so that's pretty damn cool.
Well, likewise, you sound perfectly awake on my end.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm about obviously you've been doing this for a while. So, how long have you been doing this for?
Well, I started in pro audio in 1983. Was not doing mastering at that time, but was working in pro audio in the very early days of compact disc. I would say I really started mastering in earnest in around 1988 when I got hired by A&M Studios in Hollywood, and that was really when I began. I consider my creative work. Prior to that was doing rentals for early digital audio equipment, and was in the very early days of compact disc, where most mastering studios hadn't invested in the digital gear at the time, and I worked for a company who had bought all of the early Sony digital audio gear, and I basically just took the gear to rentals at mastering studios in Hollywood, and turned out to be kind of a fortunate accident, because I got to see every mastering studio in Los Angeles and sit in on countless numbers of mastering sessions, and really get to get a feel for how the craft progressed, and from there, as I mentioned, went on to work for A&M in the 1988.
Yeah, so you went as far as doing it as a career goes. You pretty much, in terms of turning the knobs, you went straight to mastering then.
Initially, I was doing a lot of musical editing. I was doing a lot of digital editing. We had one of the first hard disk workstations, a Sonic Solutions workstation. So my first creative job at A&M was really just doing a lot of musical editing, a lot of single edits, compilation. People were mixing to DAT or to other formats, and we would put all the mixes onto the hard disk and maybe intercut various takes, sequencing, things like that. I became at the time known for being able to do single edits of songs that were 6 minutes long or something like that, and be able to come up with a creative way to shorten songs and rearrange in a lot of cases the 2-track mix in order to make a single out of it. And because we had one of the first hard disk workstations combined with CD recorders, CDR technology, it was kind of unique at the time. Today, as CD and CDR is kind of on the way out, at the time it was a big deal to be able to take your mixes and make a CD of them. So that was in the late 80s when a blank CDR was about $50.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? So did that machine have a screen like a computer so you could see the waveforms and that sort of thing?
It did, yeah. The Sonic Solution system was developed by a guy called Andy Moorer, who worked for Lucasfilm, for George Lucas, and had built a system called the ASP, the audio signal processor, that was really the first purpose-built audio workstation that Lucasfilm and George Lucas used. And he and 2 other people left that company to start Sonic Solutions in the 80s. And it was really, it doesn't look that different. If you look back at what was in the 80s, it doesn't look that different from today. It's a waveform-based editor.
Yeah.
Very capable crossfade editor. I had a little console associated with it, and it was a very early hard disk workstation, and we did hundreds, thousands of projects on it. And that was the first stuff I really did, as I mentioned, where I was having creative input and being able to do single edits and things like that, and be able to get a 6-minute song edited down to 3 minutes or something like that for radio play. And really, at the time, there weren't that many people who'd made the investment in it. It was really expensive. The system itself, the hard disk system, was $44,100, like 44.1 kilohertz sampling.
Oh man!
And then the hard disk recorder was $50,000, made by Sony and Sonic Solutions. So it was quite an investment. Of course, you could sell the room time for a lot, and you could also sell that CD ref for $200 US at the time. So it was possible to make a business out of it, but also the situation was that the buy-in was very high for the time.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're setting up a mastering studio, that's a big investment for any pro audio thing now as well. So, I mean,
it was, but that was not including whatever monitors and equalizers and other stuff you had. That was just for the workstation, was $40,000.
Yeah.
And it's all very primitive technology. By today's standards, you had a hard disk that could hold about 78 minutes worth of music, and it was, I think, $6,000. And it was the size of a smart car. All this stuff is really amazing today. What the technology capability is, and how big and primitive it was, because nobody was storing audio on hard disks. It was all kind of very much cutting edge for the time.
It was probably like 1 gigabyte of space or something like that.
It wasn't even. It was not as big as the largest CD you could record. I think it was 700 meg, and 16-bit 44.1 is roughly 10 megabytes a minute. So I think it was something like 760 meg. I don't remember. It's been a long time. It was made by Control Data, and it was giant and had a huge fan on it, and was a SCSI interface, which a young guy like yourself probably has never even heard of. But it was a kind of a primitive type of computer interface, ran on a Macintosh 2 computer, and it worked great. It all was good, and I still use a variation of Sonic Solutions to this day for mastering. It even has some of the same bugs as 1988, but it also has a lot of the same capabilities, and is still for music editing, for 2-track music editing. I think is really unparalleled. It's not a multi-track environment, but for really, if you have to really get in to do, and at the time I also worked on a lot of movie scores that before everyone had Pro Tools, you were receiving analog tape and loading a bunch of different takes into the computer, and they do a million edits in classical. I mean, there would be an edit every few bars. And so there were some, there were some soundtrack projects that would have hundreds of edits in them, and there is nowhere to hide when you're editing orchestral scores. It's not kind of like on rock where you're editing on the crescent or the downbeat or something like that. You cannot hide a bad edit. So the ability to put a small crossfade at the edit point, or really find the best musical location to make the cut was a big deal. And we were known as somebody who not only could make a super high quality transfer from analog tape, but to be able to do demanding musical editing at the time. And that was, I did a bunch of sessions for musical score releases for films that were full of edits. Now, when I do soundtracks, it comes fully edited. It's actually pretty rare to have to do any intercutting between takes. But at the time, you were doing hundreds of intercuts between different performances.
It's really interesting. So around that era, was there a particular guy or a particular mastering engineer, I suppose, that inspired you, that made you want to do it, and maybe that took you under their wing a bit in terms of showing you some secrets? Or was there someone in particular?
There are two people who influenced me tremendously. One is Joe Gastwirt, and the other is Doug Sachs. And I worked with Joe Gastwirt in the 80s when he was actually doing the mastering, and I was assisting him. He came to work at a studio that I worked at. And Joe was with CBS at the time and was doing a lot of catalog reissue work. So we were working on all different sorts of music for CBS Records. And he was the first guy that I really sat down next to and watched master. When I was doing the rentals for digital equipment, I went to every studio in Hollywood and watched the session, but I wasn't really kind of sitting next to the person watching everything they did in the way I was with Joe. I think he's the guy that really taught me the art and and science and craft of mastering. In terms of the bigger picture, I would say Doug Sachs was as influential, and was a guy that I later became friends with, late Doug Sachs. He was such a master of all of the aspects of the job that it was interesting. And one of the things I've always told people about Doug is that when I asked him what are the three most important parts in mastering, he said, well, it's simple. It's adequate parking, good-looking ref labels, and fresh coffee. And I said, but none of those things have got anything to do with mastering. What on earth does that mean? And he said, well, it's simple. If you can't park, you're already pissed off and the session hasn't started. When you're done with the session and you get your ref and you look at the label, its perceived value is what the client sees. Does it look professional? Does it look like you've actually bought something? And hey, everyone loves the smell of fresh coffee. And when you think about those things, it sounds kind of like it's being trivialized, but it's not. And I thought it was kind of interesting, because it showed not only did Doug have a complete mastery of mastering, but he understood people and he understood psychology. And then later, as I got to know him better, and the great thing about Doug is if you took him out to dinner, he would tell you anything. And so you take him to Musso and Frank's in Hollywood, and he would give you, he loved to tell stories. He loved to hold court. He loved to be kind of, we would sort of call him the godfather of mastering, because he was the first guy who did creative mastering. Prior to the Mastering Lab opening,
yep.
If you were on CBS, you mastered at CBS, and you got a flat transfer, and if you thought the ref needed a dB at 10K tough, you weren't going to get it, or you had to fight to get it.
Yeah.
Doug started creative mastering. He started artist-centric mastering, where people came to him for his impeccable sounding chain and his taste and his opinion. And that's why when I say I learned so much from Doug, it was about people. I mean, I learned about audio engineering from him as well, but I also learned about client interaction and understanding that the music always comes first, and that the emotional connection between a song and the listener, that's what you're selling in mastering. I think we've kind of gotten off into the weeds with people being very oriented towards gear and signal processing and things like that. And I think that's kind of a mistake, because really what you should be thinking about is, how does the song make you feel? Okay. And a good mastering engineer has to be sensitive to a really wide range of music. I mean, I finished up a soundtrack record that I just QC'd earlier today. Yep. And I'm doing a hip hop record from South Africa, back to back. So one is all orchestra and the other is hip hop. So you have to be able to have an aesthetic that is pretty wide ranging. And I'm not the type of person who thinks you have to go to one guy for a rock record and one guy for a jazz record or whatever. I think a good mastering engineer should be sensitive to all different styles of music. And I think that was the thing that I really learned from Doug, is that it's about technology, sure. And I certainly learned about technology from him as well. But a lot of the lesson was just about the art, and that the reason everybody is involved in this is that they love music. It's the one common denominator. I mean, in a world where you look and it looks like that no one's got anything in common, they've always got that in common.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to ask was, how do you define what you do as mastering, and does it come down to, or how do you know when you've done your job properly? Is it from the emotional response when you hear it? Is it, because more so than looking at analyzers and this type of thing, do you know it's right when you feel that it's right? Or
yes, completely. And I don't use any analyzers. I'm anti-visual in terms of mastering. I think it's a mistake and a distraction, and nobody cares what the analyzer looks like. The people only care what it sounds like, and moreover, they care how it makes them feel. So we have all kinds of tools and all kinds of FFT analyzers and all that. I think it's mostly nonsense. And what I've always tried to kind of express to people is, for every second that you're looking at the computer monitor, you're not listening as closely as you could be. So, I've got a switch that turns the monitor off in here, so I can just flip a switch, monitor goes black, and you turn the knobs till it sounds, till the sound you have in your head is what's coming out of the speakers. And so a couple days ago, I was working on a song, and it's from a guy I've worked with quite a lot. And the bottom end was way too much bottom for the type of music it was. It's kind of a sort of a light acoustic guitar and vocal song. It's got a rhythm section in parts, but it's mainly acoustic guitar and vocal. but it had a ton of sub in it, way too much sub.
Yeah.
And I put the filter in at, I don't remember, 70 hertz or some relatively high frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, it makes you feel differently about the music. The music is closer to you. The emotional content of the song is translating much more effectively than when you had all this low bottom.
Yeah.
And I sent it back to him, and he goes, "My God, what did you do?" And I said, "Well," and I would add just parenthetically, I don't always know if it's a great idea to say exactly what you did, because people might. It might kind of prejudice the engineer if you say, well, I put a 70 hertz filter in. But I've worked with this guy a lot, and I said, I filtered a lot of bottom. And he was like, yeah, it sounded like it had less bottom, but it sounded like the voice was so much more present, and the guitar was so much more present, and the energy was so much better. But I hadn't added any of those frequencies at all. I hadn't added any presence to it, maybe a little bit of extreme top. But I hadn't done anything to the presence frequencies at all. It was purely taking that low bottom out that made the song communicate so much more effectively. And that's kind of my, I hate to use a big word like philosophy, but I mean, that's kind of my thing is how does it make you feel when you play it? It's possible to adjust the perception in a way that is more satisfying. And when I heard this mix for the first time, it was obvious that all of this sub bottom was not really bringing anything musically to the communication of the song. And by getting rid of it, it sounds like you're adding mid-range and other things like that, but you really aren't.
I guess, that's maybe people not understanding the EQ, turning if you think about like a graphic, it's like if you're pushing everything on one side down, that's effectively like pushing everything on the other side up as well, isn't it? So, you're
it is in a way, and there are certain frequencies that are kind of the at least to my ear, the sort of complement of one another is that if you are to cut say 300 hertz, it makes it sound like you've actually added 3 or 4K to it, because you've taken the energy from one register and allowed there to be more energy in another register. You haven't really added 3K to it, but your ear hears more in that area. So, it's once again, there's all kinds of amazing tools today, but really, I think the number one tool is the EQ and getting comfortable with that, and getting to where you make intuitive moves. And I look down at the controls and see where they're set, but for the most part, I could almost do it with my eyes closed, because I hear the track, I hear a sound in my head that I think I would like to hear, and then I kind of mess around with the EQ and to some extent compression to get that sound to come out of the speakers. And it sounds somewhat simplistic, but that's all I really do is try to match the sound I hear in my head with the sound that I can get from the monitors.
Yep. Well, there's a quote that is from Gear Sluts, maybe from about 10 years ago, where you said mastering is, quote, a special kind of listening, unquote. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it is. I just was talking to someone else about that, and it's a special kind of listening because it's the ability to listen to everything at once, because that's how the fan listens to it. Okay, the fan does not care about the snare sound. The fan does not care that you used a vintage U47 on the vocal or whatever. So in mastering, you have to sometimes teach yourself to listen to the whole mix at once. Now, recording engineer doesn't do that. He parses everything down in his head, listens to all of those elements individually, and then is sometimes not able to listen to the entire track at once like you do in mastering. And I think if there's any skill that I have, or anyone who's been doing mastering for a long time, it's the ability to hear it like the listener hears it. And while I have the best monitors in the world and the best room in the world and whatever, you have to be able to hear it the way the fan hears it. And if you can get to that point, I think it's one of the best skills you can have. And it took me a while to get that ability. And I'm not even saying I'm completely mastered it today, but it takes a while to do it, because when you first start to master and you start to listen to what different frequencies sound like and things like that, you'll hear a song and you'll say, oh my gosh, I can listen to how much 80 hertz is on the bass. What is going on? I would never do that. But the audience doesn't hear it like that. The audience doesn't know from 80 hertz. All they know is how it makes them feel. So it is a special kind of listening. And I think it's also, to sidebar a little bit, why stem mastering is not necessarily such a great idea, because when you master from stems, you have to constantly change gears between listening to the individual elements and listening to them all combined together as a stereo mix. So if I have to spend mental energy saying, how does that shaker sound in the third verse? When I'm doing that, I've stopped listening to the whole track. So I for that reason, think stem mastering can be useful in problem cases, but to do it as a routine, I am not a fan of it for just that reason, that you have to go back and forth too much to listening to the whole thing and listening to the one element. And it's really not, in my opinion at least, how you should be listening and mastering, which is holistically.
Yeah, I think that too many people, like I'm from engineering, like the people that are doing the technical side of the music, it's probably symptomatic of people listening with their eyes a bit too much and having too much of an idealized idea of how bright things should be, or how things should be, as opposed to how does it feel? It could be technically quote unquote wrong, or it could be a bit unruly in some way, but I think people have gotten too, and probably is from there being so many tools available, they've gotten too focused on what should be right. And I guess the online communities have probably aped that a bit as well, because everybody's becomes paranoid about the same things, and they're all bouncing the same kind of buzzwords off each other. And I think that things have gotten too far away from what does it feel like. I mean, that seems obvious to me, hearing a lot of music now.
I agree with that, because I don't really look at the forum you mentioned, but I do remember people posting a picture of the EQ curve that they were using and asking, what do you guys think of this EQ curve? And it might have some enormous dip at 1K or something like that, and look quite dramatic, but it's completely meaningless. What does it sound like? Does that vocal fit in a better way if you cut all that 1K? Well, then do it. And all of the emphasis on the visual tools, I just don't get it at all. And I'm a technical guy. I've got FFT spectrum analyzers. I got all kinds of stuff. I know what it is. I know what it means, but I think it's a distraction. And, my friend Tom had a quote that I have taken as mine. Must credit him more. And it is, quote, "I can't believe how great that mix looks." And
yeah,
that's kind of the irony of this, is that there's unfortunately some of that going on, and that nobody cares how the mix looks. And there might be in the early days of someone learning to engineer, I could kind of see it, because if you had, maybe just as an example, you had a sibilance problem, and you said, well, what frequency is that's popping out that is driving me crazy on the vocal? And you look at the FFT and you say, well, it looks like it starts at 3K and goes to 20K, whatever. And you might get a feel for it. There's a Philips golden ear listening test thing that basically just has a bunch of what I'm talking about, and it's kind of get people to learn what frequencies sound like. There's one that I think might be JBL or Harman does as well, that introduces various amounts of distortion into it, and you can kind of get to the point where you start to hear the distortion and identify it. But so maybe that type of thing has a use, but when I see the spectrum analyzer being, given too much importance. I just don't really get it. If it works for somebody, great. I can't say that it doesn't have some application, but it to me, I think it's just a distraction.
Was there someone that initially taught you like which parts of the spectrum correlate to which parts of the music, or did you work all that out yourself?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. One, I always had a fancy home stereo. My father was an audiophile in the 50s, so I grew up with him building a custom stereo and having his own custom, bass, mid, and treble controls on the hi-fi at home. So, I mean, I was kind of immersed in that from a young age. In terms of getting to it with mastering, as I mentioned before, sitting with Joe Gastwirt and understanding aesthetically, what does 2K, just as an example, what does that do to a rock song? Well, you get a little bit more crack in the snare, you get a little bit more presence on everything. 4K does this, but maybe now you're picking up a little bit of sibilance in the voice and things like that. So working on all those records with Joe was instrumental to me, because it was sitting next to a guy who's extremely talented and had, worked for, I don't even know, 20 years by the time I was working with him.
Yeah.
And just getting all of the different kind of approaches that you can take, and of course, becoming friends with him and saying, well, why did you add this? Why did you cut this? What are you hearing aesthetically? And then translating into settings on an EQ and compressor. And he is a feel guy, and he was probably saying the same type of things to me as I'm saying to you now, which is through a Brooklyn accent that I won't try to imitate, but it's how does it make you feel? Does that frequency make you feel closer to the song? Does it make you tap your foot? Does it, if it's a dance song, does it make you start to move? And, what can you do that gets the desired effect? And that is really, I think, as I mentioned, that was the stuff that I learned from Joe, was just being able to sit and find out musically how to communicate the song better. And, I would add that this was all of analog tape. So there were a huge amount of technical things you had to know about analog tape in order to reproduce it accurately. So you had to really know a lot of different aspects in terms of the formats that you were dealing with. And, when you pick up a roll of tape and take a look at it and you got to try to figure it out. And sometimes, there's a lot of different formats. Is this tape NAB or CCIR? Is it a butterfly head? I mean, there's a lot of things that I don't get as much analog tape as I would like, considering I've got a huge investment in analog tape machines. But at the time, it was key to be able to play back that tape correctly. You had to start there.
Yeah, sure. Was part of that running the song through processors just to see what that imparted on the sound as well? Did he do that to show you that certain compressors with basically everything still at zero gave you a texture or a vibe as well, or?
Oh yeah, we played around with stuff like that too, and we had relatively primitive at the time, but because I started before I got involved in recording, I worked in electronics, so I knew about analog electronics. It was my specialty before I'd gotten involved in anything involving audio. So I modified a lot of the gear and had I was building the A to D and D to A converters in the 80s that were, I think still sound good today. I've gone back and listened to some of those records that we did in the 80s. And it sounds pretty healthy when I consider the relatively primitive technology of the converters of the day. I'm happy with the way that sounds. So yeah, we experimented with a lot of things like that. And in terms of, just going through a piece of gear, we had some different audio transformers we used and things like that to, for color, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, actually, on converters and clocks, do you always just use one set of converters and clocks? Because I know some guys basically try different ones for what that does for different songs and stuff as well. Or are you always just on one set now?
Yeah, I never do anything like that. I've got one converter that runs on internal clock, and that is it. And I don't put in a different XLR cable for the verse and one for the chorus or something like that. That is not me. I've got my analog chain sounding like I like it, and I've got all kinds of different things I can insert, from transformers to dirty limiters to super clean limiters. This is all in analog domain.
Yeah.
The whole clocking thing. I don't know. I've been at demonstrations with it, and I don't know. It from a technical point of view doesn't really make any sense. I have heard differences with it. I just have a really good clock at 96K on the A to D converter, and I never touch it. And frankly, I never think about it, because once I've gotten the analog chain to where I'm happy with it, I frankly don't expend any mental energy on stuff like that at all. I know it is trendy to have an atomic clock or something like that, but I just use a quartz crystal clock, and it works fine.
Yeah. So your room looks just like, it's absolutely stunning. It's absolutely amazing. Looks beautiful, but I'm sure like it's not just like beautiful to look at. I'm sure it's like incredible to sit and listen to music in. So I wanted to talk about your room. Now it was designed from scratch, is that right? And you had a fair bit to do with how it was done?
It's all done by Thomas Juan John of Northwood Acoustics. His rooms are unique. They are, in my opinion, the best. And in my more than 30 years of doing this, I've never had a room that sounds as great as this room sounds, and gives you exactly the feedback you want from the mixes. Everyone that's come in this room has been floored by how good it sounds, and this is everyone from a beginner to a grizzled veteran comes in here, and their jaw drops, because both the amount of information you're presented with is fantastic, but it's super fun to listen to music. I mean, you just put on a record and want to listen to it. It's not some type of analytical microscope like I've heard in some systems that maybe gives you a lot of detail, but I want to turn it off after 4 songs because it's not pleasing. So what Thomas has done is far and away superior to any other acoustician, and I think his success, including his recent rooms that he's done for other mastering studios, is a testimony to the fact that what he's doing is unique in the industry. And he's doing it with zero nonsense too. There's no hand waving with Thomas. It's 100% science. There's no quantum nebulizer going on here. It's all based on physics.
Yeah. So does that mean it's not like necessarily a flat environment, that it has a musical curve to it? The acoustics in the room, is that what is happening, or?
It's a lot of things. The response is flat. The response is remarkably flat. The measured response is extremely flat. As you move around throughout the room, the sound doesn't change. It's not subject to the bass buildup in the rear wall that you have in a lot of rooms. The sound is very consistent. He is conscious of making, I guess as he would put it, he's conscious of making sure that the aural cues in the room are received by the listener. And what that means is if the room is too dead, you don't get enough of the natural reverberant cues that your ear is used to hearing. So the way he positions the diffusers in the room and their location, their size, and things like that are to make sure that your ear-brain mechanism is getting the information that it needs to hear to feel natural, and that it's not too dead. Yeah. And I just was telling someone the other day who was in here, and he said, "My gosh, this room sounds fantastic." And I was bringing up something that I don't know who I learned this from, but it's something that somebody mentioned a long time ago, and it's fairly simple. When you're in a control room and you're talking to the other person in the session, how do your voices sound? Does your voice sound natural to you? Does it sound like you're used to hearing it? Does the guy you're talking to or girl you're talking to sound natural? And it's a very basic piece of analysis of test equipment, because as much as we all love the sound of our own voice, we also know what it's supposed to sound like. And if it's suddenly very chesty sounding, say, or you're hearing S's bouncing off the walls or ceiling or something like that, there's something wrong, and you don't even need an expensive calibrated microphone to tell you that. You can tell just by talking. And when you just sit in here and talk to somebody, the quality of your voice is very natural, and it has a lot of relationship to how music is going to sound in the room. Now,
that seems so obvious when you say it, doesn't it? Like,
well, it's I guess it's like every thing. It does seem obvious, but then because it's something that we're all so familiar with, it actually is a very valuable test that you can do, and I think it's true. But really, what Thomas is doing from the smallest detail to the way that all of his plans are drawn. I remember when we first were undertaking this whole thing and showed the plans to the builders, and the foreman on the job, the Finnish carpenter, kind of looked at this and he goes, "Man, I have never seen anything as detailed as this." And of course, as you get farther into it, you realize that there is layers upon layers of detail. And if he specifies a particular type of wood to make the skyline diffuser out of it, by God, you're going to go find that piece of wood, even if it's expensive and difficult to source, because there's a reason that diffuser is made out of that particular wood. And there's a million details as we went on with the project that you don't question. If he says that needs to be made like this, you do it like this. And he's right. And the results are phenomenal. It's
so things
not only is it the best room I've worked in, you trust it.
And things were literally taken to that level of detail of materials and how it affects the detail of the sound.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, some of it became expensive and difficult to source because he sources some insulation material that's not even available in the U.S. So you have to buy a cargo container full of it. And, I recently just sold 10 extra bags of it that I had that it turned out I didn't need because Thomas had another job here in L.A. that they had run out of it, and they are not specialized materials, but he's chosen it for its acoustic property, and it's just a type of insulation, but it's something that is used in Europe and not popular in the U.S. yet, so you have to import it.
Yep, but so it obviously was worth it.
Well, it's worth it because the results are fantastic, and you can absolutely trust what the monitors sound like. If some people are still having to go out to play the CD in their car to figure out how it feels, there was a time when I had to do that, and that time is long gone, fortunately, because you just turn the knobs till it sounds the way you want it to sound, and that's how it sounds everywhere else.
Yep.
No
second guessing.
Translation and yeah, exactly. So the translation and relatability are, as you know, super important in mastering. It's one of the most fundamental things is how is it going to translate? Yeah. And in Thomas's room, because it's flat and because the bottom end is highly controlled, there's no surprises.
So that room that you were in now, the monitors that you're using, were you using those monitors in a different room, and then you brought them in to the newly designed room, or?
No, I had not used ATCs. I was using Questeds, which are similar. They're not, in my opinion, not nearly as good as the ATCs, but yeah. I had Questeds that had two 10-inch woofers and a large dome mid-range and a dome tweeter. But the Questeds are in my opinion, not as good of a speaker as the ATCs. And when I first was talking to Thomas, and wasn't really 100% sold, frankly, on what he's doing. What he's doing is not different, really, than what a lot of people have done in the past. He just has a complete view of the response, the interaction of the speakers in the room, and how to get the speakers to not see the room. And that's why when you look at his designs, he'll have a glass wall on the front. There's guys that have the lathe where you look through a glass wall that the speakers are mounted in, and you see the cutting lathe on the other side of it. Now, normally, people would say, my gosh, you can't have a reflective surface like that, glass window like that. It's going to cause all kinds of problems. But in reality, the speakers don't see that wall at all. The speakers do not interact with that wall at all. Yeah. So once I got to know him and become friends with him and realized that what he was doing is a completely science-based approach, I went and listened to some rooms that he had built in Europe. He hadn't built rooms in the U.S. at the time, and they all sounded great. And when I heard one room in particular I'm trying to remember now where it was. I think it was in Cologne. Mm-hmm. It was remarkable, and I brought my little USB stick that had the songs that I liked on it, and it all made sense to me. All of the masters that I heard on there sounded both familiar, but yet more involving and more detailed and just better.
Were those songs?
And it was at that time that I realized.
Were those songs that you'd mastered, or?
Some are and some aren't. Probably about half of them are ones that I have worked on, and the other half are just records that I particularly like and I've heard a million times, and I know what they're supposed to sound like. There's a few that I use that will disclose problems in the system, or if you really don't have a big low bass response, you'll notice it. And there's some that I know are supposed to sound a little bit edgy, and if they don't sound a little bit edgy, then it's not accurate, and things like that. But they're all tracks that I'm familiar with, whether I master them or not.
Yeah, sure. So with those rooms that you visited, did they have ATCs in them, and was that part of why you changed the monitoring to ATC?
Some had B&W Nautilus 802s, which I had mastered on as well. Yeah. And it's a good speaker, but that speaker really, it has problems, and the ATCs don't have those type of problems. And certainly a lot of people have mastered successfully on Nautilus 802s. There's no question about it. But these same people have then moved to ATC 110s, with or without the sub, and are happier. The system that I heard, and I'm sorry, I wish I could remember what city it was in, that had the ATC 110s, it really spoke to me that it was a system that you could tell the interaction of the speaker and the room was a really happy one. And everything about it just communicated musically to me. And it also was something that I knew that you could work on easily, because I've had systems that sounded good, but you couldn't work on it. I had experimented with some electrostatic speakers when I was at A&M, and it sounded great, but you absolutely couldn't. I couldn't master on it. You couldn't really get the information that you needed from them, although it did sound good. But I think the ATC is a system that both sounds great and is a phenomenal tool as well.
Was that with the the type of the model of whatever of the speakers, was that taken into consideration when the room was designed as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, the room is designed around ATC speakers. Thomas will put any speaker you want in there. He's done rooms with PMC. He's done rooms with B&W, but given his choice, he'll put ATCs in.
Okay. And I was looking at the photos of where you sit in the mastering position. You've got the I don't know what you call it, the racks with the gear in it. And I was thinking, it's funny, you'd think that would be somehow that would affect the sound, like having a big block of furniture essentially in front of you. But I mean, obviously that doesn't, I mean, that either factors in or it doesn't do anything negative to having accuracy in the listening position.
Well, there's a couple things to know about that. One, that furniture is designed by Thomas, and that's a Northward Acoustics rack.
Right.
It's built to be as acoustically transparent as possible. In fact, as you look at it, it's full of slots, so it's designed to be as benign as possible.
I did see
actually
that,
quite low by standards. Yeah, it's quite low by standards of other consoles, and it also is a certain distance from the speaker, so it's actually something that he's considered in terms of the acoustics of the room, and I love it. I think I had the first one in the U.S. And it's ergonomically great. It has everything at arm's reach, and I set it up with the EQs in the center and the compressors on the right. So the stuff that I'm using the most is in front of me, and then the compressors are just at arm's reach to the right, and then the things I use less are on the left-hand side. But it looks cool, ergonomically is great, and acoustically it is as benign as possible for something with something that is, after all, in the room. But you keep it as low as you can, and you keep it as transparent physically as possible.
And I mean, I guess unless you are a completely digital setup, there's no way to physically make it like not there. You know what I mean? It has to physically be there if you're going to use the device, doesn't it? So I mean, you can't eliminate it.
It does. Yeah, it does. I have the smallest monitor practical in front, and it really doesn't bother me now. Across the hall from my studio is an identical Northward room, everything identical, but it has a Avid S6 console for mixing, and Craig Bauer, who mixes in that room, will sometimes he'll say, "Hey, will you listen to this mix that I'm working on?" And he'll come over here and listen to it, and he goes, "Wow, you can really hear the influence of the large format console he has in the room there compared to when it comes into my room and listens to it. Speakers the same, everything is identical. The difference is you don't have this large reflective surface that you have with his large format console in there. And of course, if you want to have a large console like that, there's no way around it. But what Thomas did with his furniture is to try to get as low of an influence as possible through it.
Given that it's important to be getting, your hands on those analog processors that you like, and you're going to have that furniture there. All that said, how often with your workflow do you never go actually through all that? Is it actually just ever entirely a digital master?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I do a good percentage of records all digital. If it sounds great, if it sounds perfect, there's no reason to bring it back to analog. I do a good percentage of things.
Right. Yeah.
All digital. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and really, if the mix sounds great, there's no compelling reason to bring it back to analog. I'm very proud of the D to A and A to D conversion I've got together here. It doesn't change the sound very much at all, but it doesn't change the sound as little as staying all digital, in which case there's no coloration at all.
Yeah, I remember. Again, it was back in the dark ages of the Gear Sluts forum. I remember you saying something along the lines of that quite often a lot of your masters are done with just one EQ and one limiter. Do you remember? Does that sound like something you'd say?
Yeah, no question.
Yeah. Does
I don't
that
know
still
if that
hold true nowadays?
Well, sure, yeah, and I don't know if that was regard to analog or digital, but it's super common. In fact, I would say that is probably more often than not the setup that I'm running is going to be one or maybe two EQs and straight into a digital limiter in terms of all in the box signal path.
Mm-hmm.
Super common to have just one digital EQ and one digital limiter. Sure, absolutely, and while I've got 4 great compressors, I think that people have kind of gotten the idea that mastering involves running through a compressor. And, you can certainly improve the sound with the compression. I'm not afraid to use it, but it more often than not is not better. And, it just depends. I've got a switch and I can punch a button and put the compressor in and make a fair test of it. But I would say I don't compress more than I do compress, if that's the question.
Yeah, and is that partly because things are coming in super compressed as well? Is that partly why, or?
It could be. It depends, but I think that sometimes you want to make it jump a little bit. You want to put a little bit of movement in it, and that's what can be great with a compressor, whether it's like a SSL type or a tube compressor or whatever like that. Sometimes you're actually trying to introduce a little bit of pumping into a little bit of movement in it, and that's great. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about initially, and it might make you nod your head suddenly because you've put a little bit of jump in it, and that is the trick. And to be able to figure out what settings on the compressor are, all the compressor ever does is turn it down after all. So you have to get a sort of with practice get a feel for what kind of settings are gonna get you there. But I think what you're saying is broadly true, that mixes come in with a lot of compression on them. They come in with a lot of peak limiting as well sometimes too, and that is a whole separate story. But certainly not afraid of compression.
So when you're talking about going into a limiter, though, are you talking about a broadband limiter, or you're not talking about a multi-band processor if you're in the box and there's not much else to do? I
generally use a full band limiter. I have experimented with a bunch of different multi-band limiters. And in terms of multi-band processing period, I have no problem with it. But when I say multi-band, I'm probably just using one band. And if the needs to be reined in a little bit, then from 20 to 200 hertz will have its own band, and that can be a super powerful technique. De-essing is, after all, a one-band limiter, a one-band compressor, and that's something I do quite a bit as well, whether analog or digital. And I think the problem with multiband is if you put in 5 bands, it initially sounds impressive, but it really changes the mix a lot, and it can be kind of a double-edged sword because it also generates kind of a fatigue factor to me too. But generally, for peak limiting, as far as the last stage in the chain, that's 99% of the time full band.
Yeah. Is there something else other than? The question I wanted to ask is there something or a couple of consistent things that you hear on mixers nowadays, which maybe is a newer thing that is working against the musicality, and you're hearing it all the time? And do you have something to comment on with that?
Oh, if it would be one thing, just too much peak limiting on the stereo mix. I mean, that's the thing that can kind of tie my hands a little bit, and you can't undo it. EQ, you can always reverse whatever EQ has been done, you can always reverse it back. But a mix that comes in too loud, it does make my job harder. I never really can get as great of a result as I could if something was a little quieter, and it could just be like a dB less of peak limiting, and I can produce a better master with it. That's, to answer your question, I think if there's one thing that actually can make my job harder, it's getting a mix in that's too loud, and it's easy for the engineer to make a print with less limiting. I do think in terms of advice that people have been given that I think is absolutely wrong, it's to remove all bus processing and you mix the song and then remove all bus processing and send it to the mastering engineer. And I think that's insanity, because your mix decisions have been made based on these stereo bus processing.
So if you're going to mix
inserts.
Yeah, so if you're going to do that, just have nothing on the master bus, period, kind of thing. Is that what you're saying?
You can't just take it off. But if you want to send me a version with less limiting on it, that's great. But if you've got a EQ and a compressor and limiter on it, and you've been living with that mix in a particular way, and suddenly you've read somewhere that you just bypass all that and run it past and send that to the mastering engineer, it doesn't make any sense, because that's not what you've been mixing through. So, but I mean, really, to go back to the earlier question, if there's one thing, it's too much peak limiting, and it's easy enough to just knock that threshold down a few dB and send me an alternate version, or send me the version that you've been listening to, or you've been comparing it to something else. That's fine, but that's really the thing that can make my job harder, because you can't really unclip it once it's been clipped.
And is that problem something that exists in the, like, for lack of a better word, the sort of the lower levels of mixes you get sent, or is that the problem even up at the highest levels as well?
Yeah, it can happen. It can happen at any level. I don't know if it's got anything to do with experience necessarily. Some of the best, most experienced mixers will send you a track that is essentially done from the time I receive it. It's at a competitive level. It's equalized in a balanced musical way, and you're looking at something that's closer to a flat transfer. And that's not to say that some people that are less experienced aren't producing fantastic work as well. I hear stuff all the time from people that are not super experienced that sounds amazing.
It's in Bob Katz's book about mastering. There's the fabled scenario of, like, theoretically, if a mix comes in sort of like what you just described, that maybe you'll do like absolutely nothing except for dithering, because it will require nothing at all. Have you actually had that where you've literally done nothing to it?
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course. And there are certainly times where nothing I do makes it any better. No processing, no adjustments I do communicate the musical emotion any more effectively than how the mix sounds. Now, I would say that that's something that takes you a while to learn. And one of the hardest things to learn is when to cut it flat, because everybody wants to do something. You got all this gear, you got all these buttons and knobs and plugins. You want to do something. And it's one of the hardest things to learn is when you're done. And one of the hardest things to learn is when the mix that you received is not benefiting from any of your subsequent processing, that it's ready to go as it is. So sure, that absolutely happens.
This is the lost wisdom that's the opposite of all the online, hey man, what's your go-to mastering chain? Like, yeah.
Well, your go-to mastering chain should be nothing, and add from there. That really is where the conversation should go. But you always got to realize that this stuff is kept in business by gear manufacturers. They want to sell you gear. They want to sell you the idea that if you just had the latest, greatest new thing, you'd be able to make a much better record. If only I had some new plugin. If only I had the latest, greatest compressor, I'd be able to do even better work.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's run by manufacturers. They don't call it listening sluts.
That's it. I was gonna ask you, with the fact that everything's become more online streaming, has that affected, because of with the loudness normalization thing that's happening, has that affected your overall levels in more recent times?
Oh, yeah, and I've done a lot of experimentation with that, and it has. I think really, if you can make a version for CD and a version for streaming, it's a good idea, and I do that, and I think there's a lot of information available online with regard to different levels that people have tried and different amounts of attenuation that comes from loudness normalization and things like that. And I absolutely think that's a reality. I was just telling someone today about YouTube and right-clicking on the video and looking at Stats for Geeks and seeing how much that track has been turned down by YouTube's loudness normalization. Now there is some confusing aspects to it because depending on how you're listening to it, it may not have any normalization at all. And I think when you listen to Spotify, if I listen to Spotify through the Spotify application, it sounds one way.
Mm-hmm.
If I listen to it through my Sonos system, it sounds a different way. The Sonos doesn't appear to be applying the same amount of loudness normalization as the application does. So some of that is a little bit of a variable, but in general, sure, I think that's something that everybody should be aware of today, and that you can upload something to YouTube and take a listen to it and see how it's being affected by their processing, and to always avoid any type of transcoding, which is a fancy word for going through two lossy stages, and that is really trouble. That's something that never sounds good and can really give bizarre, unpredictable results. But if you can do a version for streaming and a version for CD separately, I think it's definitely a good idea.
So have you ended up putting out like a less limited version with the streaming?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, and it's very much analogous to doing a vinyl master version, that you do a separate pass with anything from no peak limiting to much less peak limiting, because in the case of vinyl, you're not getting the apparent level from the source. You're getting it from the lacquer cut, and so that's kind of counterproductive, sending a master that's too limited to the lacquer cutter. But it's similar type of thing to loudness normalization, although strictly speaking not identical. But there are more versions today than ever, and so it's not uncommon to have a CD version, a streaming version, and a lacquer version that are separate passes.
And is it ever the same one for all of them? Have you ever?
Sure. Sometimes there's no budget to do 3 different versions, and it doesn't mean that it can't sound good. And I can certainly think of cases where only one version was sent, and I've heard it streaming, and I've heard a LP record of it, and it all sounds fine. It maybe could have been better with a separate version, but I had no problem with the quality of it on any of the formats, and there was no consideration made at all for the other formats, but yet it still sounded good.
And if you had to make that decision, if you could only do one, did you make it dynamically sort of somewhere in the middle, or?
Well, these were records that I didn't even know were going to be put out streaming or on vinyl. This was something that I provided a 4416 CD master for, and then later heard it streaming, and then later heard a vinyl record made from it that I know they made from my 4416 digital, because I never produced any masters but that.
Yeah.
So it had to have come from that format.
Mm-hmm. Well, I reckon I should probably let you get back to work, I suppose, or whatever the day is holding for you today.
thank you so much for your time and interest, and I really enjoyed speaking with you today.
No, honestly, it's been a real privilege to get to speak to you, and you are one of the really big guys, both in experience and in your catalog and your career is like obviously like incredibly impressive. So it's been I've really appreciated getting to have a chat, man. It's really, really, really cool.
Thank you, Owen. It's a real pleasure. Have a good day, and I'll speak to you soon.
Yep, you too. All right, catch you around.
All right. Okay, cheers.
Bye.